Fear of failure. It's something we all experience, but for entrepreneurs, it can feel like an ever-present shadow. How do you face that fear, overcome the shame, and move forward with confidence? Welcome to Anatomy of Failure, the podcast where we're dissecting what went wrong so you can get it right. I'm your host, Ivy Walker, and this week we're tackling this universal challenge in an episode titled Conquering the Fear of Failure. Joining me today is Megan Bruneau, a therapist who specializes in helping entrepreneurs and high achievers navigate the emotional roller coaster of building a business. Together, we'll explore what fear of failure really is, how shame and perfectionism fuel it, and practical strategies to reframe and conquer these emotions. Whether you're in the thick of launching your next big idea, managing a setback, or just looking for tools to grow as a leader, this conversation will leave you with actionable insights to build resilience and self-compassion. So grab your coffee, take a deep breath, and let's dive in to conquering the fear of failure. Today, I'm here with Megan Bruneau, a therapist who specializes in working with entrepreneurs, and we're going to dive into a couple of topics. But first, Megan, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me here, Ivy. I'm super excited for our conversation. It's such an important one. And yes, in terms of my background, I have a master's in counseling psychology. So I'm trained traditionally as a psychotherapist. And I've been working clinically for almost 2 decades at this point. However, about a decade ago, I moved to New York and started working with entrepreneurs there and just noticed that there are sort of unique vulnerabilities that entrepreneurs bring to the table in terms of perhaps mental health challenges that they might be sort of predisposed to, and then also the lifestyle, of course, is also very challenging and a lot causes us to be that much more vulnerable. So over the last decade, I've been working almost primarily or exclusively with entrepreneurs and other high achievers, attorneys, surgeons, executives, C-level executives, And so what I do is I really work with people to help them recognize where their fear of failure or really fear of emotional discomfort, their emotional avoidance, as I like to describe, is holding them back from either reaching their professional goals or their personal goals and causing whether it's, anxiety or depression or, not the best relationship to certain, substances or activities and whatnot. So, that's mostly what I do today. While I'm still a therapist, by training, I work as a coach now. And I also, I speak, I write. I also have a podcast myself, called The Failure Factor, which is also all about failure. Interviewing people about their experiences of challenge or failure, building their businesses, and really kind of like getting into the nitty gritty of it. So that's kind of where I am today.
So Megan, let's start off with a definition of fear of failure so we can help those who are watching or listening get a sense of exactly what we're talking about.
Totally. So, again, through a more clinical lens, we might call this perfectionism, right? Perfectionism and fear of failure are very linked. However, really, it's less about a fear of failure and more about a fear of the emotional discomfort that comes along with failure and a fear of like what failure might mean, like what that says about us if we are to fail. So maybe this is an opportunity for me to pass it back to you for a moment, Ivy, and say, like, when you think about failure and having that experience, what are some of the emotions that are connected to it for you?
Yeah, that's a great question, Megan. So, I recently had to even admit to myself that I had this fear of failure, and the emotions that it brought up for me were embarrassment and shame.
Yes.
Really feeling like I was not who I thought I was as a result of one of the businesses that I had started, and actually the one that had grown the fastest, that one having to wind it down this year. So worrying about how other people would see me, the judgment,
Yes.
Worrying about sort of schadenfreude, people thinking like, yeah, finally she got hers,
Right.
all of those were the emotions that I had to work through. And they kind of caught me off guard, especially the shame. It really kind of caught me off guard.
Yes. And shame, I mean, gosh, it is such a pervasive emotion in our society. I'll talk more about shame. It's really core to this work, understanding shame, understanding how it shows up in our bodies, understanding how to metabolize it. But that is something that is a huge part of failure and the fear of failure. And I just, first of all, so appreciate your vulnerability, Ivy, and sharing that. Those fears like, yes, embarrassment, shame, feeling exposed, feeling in some cases like judged or rejected or criticized, or like just that kind of icky feeling that you described of experiencing potentially other Schadenfreude, which may have been like a projection of your own, but also like, let's be real, that's a very real thing, right? People kind of, we compare ourselves to others. And so that's why people love reading tabloids, because they want to see like, oh, see, look at that person failing at life in some way. I'm not so bad after all. Right. So those emotions are excellent examples of why people are so afraid of failure. It's not about the story. It's not about the thoughts necessarily. It's really about the bodily sensations that come along with it. And I want to take a moment and just offer a little bit of, I guess, a scientific or evolutionary understanding of this emotional avoidance. And stay with me and let me know if you have any questions. But ultimately, our emotions are evolutionarily adaptive. So what I mean by that is that they are there to protect us and to help us procreate or proliferate the human race. They're all about like staying in groups. They're what we call prosocial. They're all about, staying safe at night when you fall asleep and you have, others to protect you, or, being able to stay warm when it's cold because you're in a group, being able to get in on the kill. Obviously these are all historical kind of uses of these emotions, but that is why, everything in our body is, you would describe as evolutionary, has an evolutionary purpose, right? And so our emotions are very much along those lines. And unfortunately in our society, we really, stigmatize emotions, and especially for men, but also for entrepreneurs and whatever gender, because we really perceive ourselves to be like strong and independent and capable. And emotions are seen as sort of like vulnerable, or, if we show any anxiety or any sadness or any kind of signs of weakness that emotions are associated with, then we worry that we will be perceived as incompetent. And we perceive ourselves in that way. And so we feel shame as well. So the reason that I want to give this background on emotions is because a big part of overcoming our fear of failure and learning how to work with these emotions is coming to a place where we can actually start to notice them in our bodies and understand them and respond to them in healthier ways. So I'm going to give you an example. So if you are feeling anxiety about something, which is very common as an entrepreneur, right? That really is fear, anxiety. Some people might define them as different things. They really are the similar emotion in our body. Some professionals might say that, anxiety is about something in the future and fear is about something that's present. But for the purposes of our conversation, I'm going to use them interchangeably. So let's say that you are feeling fear or anxiety because you don't have certainty that something is going to succeed, right? So let's go back to your example, if you don't mind, for a moment. So when you reached that point where you started feeling like the embarrassment or shame, or were afraid of those feelings, I'm guessing there was some fear in there or some anxiety.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Would you be willing to share a bit what that was like for you to feel that anxiety?
It actually, I would describe it as having felt like an existential threat in some ways. Like, there was a part of my life that was ending, or there was some threat that my life was going to end. And it felt very surreal because obviously I knew my life wasn't ending. But it was overwhelming to try to understand what this was. And I had to take a step back at one point, and I said, I have to figure out what's going on with me right now.
Yes.
Because not only was I feeling that anxiety and like I was under threat, but then I was reacting to every single thing that happened like it was a threat. Whereas,
exactly.
At one point, if something went wrong, I would have just said, okay, well, that's interesting. What do we do differently? Now it felt like the world was ending and my reactions were overreactions. And so I actually had to take a step back and take a couple of days off work and just kind of figure out what was going on.
Right. Because you were in a state of hyperarousal. You were hypervigilant to whatever the threat was, which, by the way, of course you can sit here now and say, the world wasn't ending or my life wasn't ending. But it does feel that way, especially when our identities are so intertwined with our businesses, right? So for you, the thought of like, oh my gosh, like what if this fails, like my life is over, or you start kind of creating all these stories about what that means.
Right.
And so whether a person is in that stage of kind of their failure process where it feels really imminent, or even let's say somebody who's wanting to launch a business, but that perfectionism, that fear of failure is holding them back because they're like, I don't want to put myself out there. I don't want to even risk the possibility of what, Ivy went through there, right? Of that experience. Right. And so again, coming back to the evolutionary purpose of emotions, our emotions are meant to feel very uncomfortable and they're meant to make us want to react, right? So like, again, if we're on the savannah, 100,000 years ago and a tiger or whatever we encounter, that instinct or that emotion of anxiety, of fear, we want to react quickly to it. We want to flee or we want to freeze or we want to fight, right? And that's what we're supposed to do. We're not supposed to be sitting there thinking about it and being like, is this a real threat? Is this not a real threat? Like we're just supposed to react, right? So our emotions are meant to make us want to react. And our work here, our spiritual work, our growth work, not just as entrepreneurs, as humans, is to learn how to be with the discomfort long enough to decide, do I want to react to this or do I want to respond in an intentional way? And now listen, there are definitely places where our emotions are telling us the truth, right? Like, let's say we feel guilt, which again is a very, productive emotion in certain instances. You have, you say something to your business partner that's mean or disrespectful, and then you feel guilt afterwards. That's really healthy because that emotion is saying, hey, there's been a rupture in a relationship that you care about. You want to repair that. And again, coming back to emotions being pro-social, guilt is there to say, okay, let's fix that. Let's have a difficult conversation, right? Same thing with like, if we're feeling lonely, let's reach out. Like all of these emotions are meant for us to react to them and not really think about it too much. But again, let's come back to the example of you're feeling some anxiety or fear around either like launching a business or where you are in the stage of your business. And you're just in that reactive state, as it sounds like you were, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So really what we want to be able to do in those instances is be able to regulate our nervous system, because ultimately it sounds like you were quite dysregulated in that state. And that's where, again, we're in that kind of like fight, flight, or freeze state versus in this more, what we call the window of tolerance, which is where we're able to kind of like think more clearly and make decisions from a more grounded place. And so ultimately what you want to be able to do in those situations is recognize, okay, fear is telling me to do one thing, but I don't know if that's actually the best thing to do here. Can I live alongside this fear? Can I kind of like be with the discomfort of it all to make the decisions that feel like maybe a calculated risk, or, set myself up for whatever might happen if this does fail? Can I work through some of those stories that I'm telling myself? Can I work through the worst case scenario? All sorts of things that we might do in coaching, right? But I guess sort of the gist of what I'm trying to say here is that a big part of this work, which I'm sure we'll get into, is recognizing we're not supposed to just avoid our emotions and react blindly to them. And unfortunately in our society, because we tell people like having emotions means we're emotional and that means we're weak, when we start feeling something, we just, sometimes even unconsciously, a lot of the times unconsciously, numb it, suppress it, keep moving. And then next thing you know, we're moving toward burnout. We've made terrible decisions. We're being reactive. We've destroyed relationships. We've got addictions. And so I know this is a very long sort of initial explanation, but it's really just to underscore how inextricably linked the fear of failure is to our emotional discomfort, and to sort of lend credibility to our emotions rather, because I don't want you to write me off as being like, oh, here she is. She's a therapist. She's coming on and talking about emotions. Great. Like, never mind, next, right? Like, no, it is so important to start to gain that emotional intelligence, because that is truly the weapon that will allow you to not only overcome your fear of failure, or work with your fear of failure, I should say, because that fear is always going to be there in some capacity, but also to be able to gain, the skills to have the difficult conversation, to put yourself out there and fundraise when, you're scared of being rejected, to put yourself on a podcast, or camera or whatever, if you're afraid of being exposed. And that I think will be a big part of what we talk about today.
Yeah. So I want to go back, in your discussion, you talked a lot about feelings in our bodies. And I think that's an important point that we often overlook when we're talking about emotions. So most of us have been taught, or we've believed, that emotions are sort of this cognitive process. It's this ephemeral thing. And we don't really connect or understand the impact that those emotions have in our bodies. Like those are actual hormones, chemicals, like they live in the body. Can you talk about the importance of noticing what's going on in our body when we start reacting and feeling these emotions?
Yes, absolutely. Exactly as you said, Ivy. I mean, it's really only recently that we've sort of dove into understanding the somatic experience of emotions. And that's where like you're hearing a lot more now about somatic therapies, polyvagal therapy, various different kind of ways of processing that allow us to actually move these emotions through us, because they're energy. And at least the sort of leading theory right now is that this energy gets stored in our body and stored as trauma if we don't process this and we don't move it through. So a very well-known therapist or I think he's a psychologist, Peter Levine, wrote a book called Waking the Tiger. I think it was back in the 90s, I want to say. And this book was all about how animals in the wild, when they experience an event that feels sort of like traumatizing or triggering, that kind of fight or flight experience, they will shake off their trauma and they will kind of like shake. And then that'll kind of help them like get back to a very regulated state. Humans don't do this. We suppress our emotions, and then that shows up in our body as trauma. At least, again, those are sort of what some of the stuff we can't prove. They're theories that we can't we haven't disproven yet, right? But we can't fully prove. But those are the theories that again and again have a lot of weight behind them. And so ultimately the idea is that yes, like even though we name our emotions, we're like, okay, I feel lonely, or I feel sad, or I feel angry. What's really happening is we're having a physiological process, and really the language just puts words to what's happening in our body. That's sort of what language does, right? It gives words to our experience. It makes sense of our experience, but really it is just sort of a translation of what our bodies are telling us. So if you even think about, anger is one that I just mentioned. And again, through the evolutionary lens, anger is there to say a boundary's been crossed, or you've been mistreated, or, you need to advocate for someone or something, and injustice has occurred. Again, there's a really beautiful place for anger. It's called righteous anger, is sort of the more spiritual lens to look at it through. But again, when we feel anger, I think anyone listening can probably remember the last time they felt it, unless you're someone who suppresses it a lot, of which there are people who do that too. But when you feel anger, that is something that is so intense in your body. It's almost impossible to not be reactive, right? Like that idea of seeing red and just like feeling, just like flushing. Again, like you said, there are all sorts of physiological processes that are causing that energy to just like be like, all right, let's move that, blood, for example, to your large muscle groups away from your prefrontal cortex so you can get ready to fight or flee. Your pupils dilate to be able to take in more information. Your digestion turns off. You start sweating. Like there's all sorts of stuff that's happening physiologically in our bodies with emotion. And again, in a perfect world, when we felt emotions, we would like dance or move or, shake it off truly. But we don't do that. We just kind of like bury it deeper and deeper. And then it gets kind of stuck and feels stagnant. And that leads, or again, at least, the theories suggest that leads to things like depression or chronic anxiety or somatic ailments, physiological ailments like backaches and headaches and tension overall, sleep issues. The list goes on. So, emotions are very much physiological, and a big part of the work of really coming to learn to dance with our emotions or metabolize them in a healthy way is being able to be in our bodies and recognize them, and usually probably practice some self-compassion or some, coping skills such as, self-regulation or co-regulation with someone else, which we can talk about, and be able to kind of move the emotion through. And that prevents it from being trapped and stuck. And that keeps us sort of both emotionally and physically healthy.
So can you talk a little bit about why it seems that identity and self-esteem are so tied to failure or success with entrepreneurs and founders? Why that's everybody has their self-esteem and they have their perspective of success and failure, but it seems to be so much more acute among entrepreneurs. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, I would say there are a few reasons. So first of all, I like to describe when working with my clients, like to sort of encourage them to diversify their portfolio of self-worth, because it becomes, it's like they've invested all of their self-worth into this one thing, right? And so no wonder they're terrified of failure of this one thing, because to them, it really represents their worth and their value and all. And again, you mentioned the existential threat, right? So like their sense of purpose and meaning and belonging in this world, their sense of relevance, like that could disappear overnight. And if that disappears overnight, they've got nothing left. So that's one of the reasons. There are a few, but that's why I again suggest that people, yes, of course, if you were going to look at like the pie graph of your self-worth for a year of your life or a moment in time, maybe 80% of it would feel like it was your venture, right? But is there some room for family, friends, hobbies, self-care, your spiritual or personal growth? Are there other things in there, volunteering or service that's unrelated to your work? Like, are there other things in there that will allow you to remind yourself, like, I have a sense of belonging and relevance in this world beyond my venture. And there are also things that maybe bring me a sense of joy or connection or meaning or satisfaction, any of those types of things. Because again, talking about feelings, we're looking for those feelings. We're looking for those experiences. And the entrepreneurial roller coaster is one in which like it can almost feel abusive at times and addictive, right? Because it's like, oh, like, hi, yes, win. Oh no, lose. Oh no, this is everything's terrible. Oh, and then I hit this win. And it's like, it's beautiful in many ways. I like to say entrepreneurship is a really beautiful spiritual opportunity because it does force us to learn how to be with those emotions if we want to stay on it for very long. But ultimately, that is definitely one of the reasons, and that you've kind of like put all your eggs in the entrepreneurship basket. But there are a couple of others as well. So it does seem that as I said, there's like a predisposition with entrepreneurship for certain mental health conditions. And part of the reason for that is that we are just more like there's a selection effect, right? So people who are maybe predisposed to bipolar disorder or ADHD or depression or anxiety or more vulnerable to addictions, or maybe have like a fearful avoidant attachment style. Like there's a lot of different things there that actually have like a bit of a selection effect where a person with some of those conditions or those symptoms would probably find themselves in maybe a more creative space, or maybe struggling more with authority, or, maybe can like work really, really hard, fits and spurts, work hard or maybe, has such a personal connection to whatever company they're building because of their own journey with it, that like, that's where they're like, okay, I've got to change the world doing this thing. And so there is a selection effect where among entrepreneurs, there are more of those types of, mental health conditions, we'll say. And oftentimes, if we look at that through a developmental lens, again, there's certainly there's often genetic factors, there are biological factors, but a lot of this is developmental in terms of what people bring into, their day to day when it comes to their mental health. And so a lot of times entrepreneurs were the type of people who grew up with either like super high expectations or believing that their self-worth was really attached to like outcomes or achievement or appearance, like things that are sort of outside of themselves, and maybe didn't have like the most secure family dynamics necessarily. And I'm definitely not saying that that's always the case. Like there are many, many entrepreneurs with incredible, beautiful family dynamics. But a lot of the times you will find people, or the clients that I work with certainly, who feel like if they fail, they are worthless and they are unloved, and they have this sort of connection between, if I am doing well, if I succeed, if I'm getting straight A's, if I get into the college that I applied for, if I made the team, if I, whatever the sort of challenges that they believe they need to meet, then I am good enough. Then I am worthy. Then I am loved. And so that's another layer in which, for entrepreneurs, when they really attach their self-worth to, or their identity, like you said, to their venture, it's often because that has been kind of the way that they've lived for a long time. And it has been like, I have to protect my ego or my self-worth at all costs. And it's all dependent on outcomes, achievement, appearance, success, those sort of factors outside of myself, versus, sure, I want to do well. Of course, I want to grow. I want to, perform. I want to succeed. But like, if things don't work out, I can kind of like go home to my, I don't know, like loving family and other interests and, you know, and trust that like I'll pick myself up and be able to do just fine and I'll be welcomed with open arms.
So what approaches, either from a therapeutic perspective or elsewise, what approaches to working through this kind of mental health profile or the kinds of situations that we as founders and entrepreneurs intentionally subject ourselves to? What kinds of therapies are effective for that?
Yeah. So, I use a number of modalities, honestly, with clients. And I don't think that there's not a one size fits all approach, right? Like the beautiful thing about this work is, especially with coaching, you know, we want to try to figure out, okay, what is going to really speak to our clients and like what sort of motivates them, what drives them, like how can I establish trust with them so they know that like I'm working for them and I don't have my own agenda. Like I'm trying to figure out what is going to resonate for you. And so, but a couple of things that are generally quite helpful is, if I was going to describe a couple of different modalities, I'll do that. And then I'll give you some examples of various different interventions. Like something like ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy, is very effective with entrepreneurs because it's sort of a combination of like helping align with values. So you can really hone in and be like, okay, like what are your values? Like what is most important to you? Let's say in your lifetime here, right? Maybe you're lucky to live 75, 80, 90 years on this planet, which again, none of us is guaranteed that, right? By any means. But should you be so lucky as to live that long, like what's important to you in your journey here? And sure, I mean, success is one of those things likely, right? Like, you know, I want to be successful or I want to change the world or I want to make enough money to be financially stable and not have to worry about money or whatever, those sorts of things. But there are other pieces as well, right? Like nobody wants just written in their eulogy or their gravestone, they were very successful. You know, they did this and this and this, right? There are other elements that are generally quite important to people. And that usually comes in the form of like connection. I want to experience love. I want to maybe have children. I want to have an impact on others. I want to have experiences. I want to travel. I want to be present. Like, so helping kind of zoom out and be like, okay, here's one area. And don't worry, we're not going to ignore this place that you value, which is about success and about growth and about oftentimes, you know, there is a values piece in that that's related to like meaning or purpose and having an impact. So really kind of like, okay, we're looking at that as well. But let's also just like recognize the other areas of your life that are important. Because what I find with a lot of my clients is they are killing themselves trying to meet this one goal and they are sacrificing all of these other things. They're sacrificing their ability to be present and experience joy. They're sacrificing their health. They're sacrificing their ability to find a healthy relationship, you know, or which ultimately might be aligned with their goals of perhaps being a parent at some point. They're sacrificing their ability to, to travel, to experience, to sleep, to have spontaneity, all of those sorts of things. Because when we are so, totally mired in like, produce. And we're just running from a place of shame and we're beating ourselves up for not being productive all the time. And we're feeling all this anxiety. It really does sap away the joy of life. So that's one of the areas that I tap into, which is like, okay, let's just like align with your values. Like what's important to you here? Because I'm always going to respect if my client is like, nothing else matters to me. All I want to do is be successful. And I don't care if I kill myself doing it. I'm like, okay, we're going to see how I can help you here. And there's certainly things we can still do because there's obviously still emotional avoidance happening there that's preventing them from doing the hard things to be more successful. But I'd say in my, almost 20 years of working with clients and 10 years of working with entrepreneurs, I can only think of one client who has come in and said, I don't care about my mental health. I don't care about my well-being. I don't care about anything else. All I care about is making money and being successful. So usually people have enough wherewithal to be like, okay, there are other things that are important to me, right? So that's one area. But also part of the ACT is something called self-compassion. And that is a hugely important piece that I work with clients to establish. Now, self-compassion is one of those words or terms that I always want to explain because it can have a similar effect as talking about emotions as a therapist and coach. People are like, well, self-compassion, no, like I don't want any of that like fluffy stuff. Like, no, we're not going there. And so the way I actually describe it is like kind of becoming your own inner coach or developing your own inner coach. And a lot of entrepreneurs are or were athletes at some point. And even if they weren't, they maybe did something at a high level where they can appreciate having a coach or a teacher or a supervisor, instructor who was like had that really nice balance of like, okay, we still have high expectations, right? Like you are still expected to show up for practice, even if it's at 6 a.m. You're still expected to play the game in the rain or whatever it is. You're still expected to, run lines like when you're in training. And yeah, like we're still having high expectations for you to grow and do the hard things. And also when you miss that penalty kick or field goal or serve or whatever it is, and you lose the game or the match, we're not coming up to you as a coach and saying, you are so bad. You are the worst athlete I've ever seen. You should just quit right now, right? We're seeing that as a growth opportunity. We're acknowledging, yeah, like maybe you should have made that, or maybe sometimes not a lot of people make it, depending on what it is. But we're seeing these disappointments, failures, not meeting expectations as opportunities for growth. And really is a sign, actually, that you did something outside your comfort zone, which is amazing because we need to step out of our comfort zones to be able to grow. So with self-compassion, what we are doing is we are actually giving ourselves the language and the somatic experience to metabolize those difficult emotions and to recognize that, like, hey, our self-worth actually isn't dependent on just outcomes, achievements, and appearance. Like, for example, it's really about having unconditional love for ourselves, and still, again, having expectations and having integrity and, wanting growth and all of those sorts of things, but being able to respond to ourselves in a kind way. So what happens is most people, when they notice they're feeling a difficult emotion, they are really hard on themselves. Or when they notice that they did something that maybe wasn't within their integrity, or, they felt like they didn't meet expectation, they're super self-critical. And that's where shame really comes in, right? That sort of like chronic underlying shame that's like, at the core, you're bad and unworthy, and you're only lovable if you're successful all the time. So anytime we aren't being constantly successful, shame's like, hey, hi, I'm watching you, you're terrible, right? So maybe we can go back to your example again for a moment, Ivy. And if you can recall during that time that sounded just like so agonizing and intense and stressful and overwhelming, some of the emotions you explained, you said embarrassment, you said shame, you said anxiety. When you were feeling those emotions, if you were aware of it, do you recall like what your relationship to yourself was like?
I questioned who I thought I was. That was the main thing. And a lot of things that I did, I became irritable about and critical about. Yes. Things that didn't bother me previously. So for example, even, and this was weird to me because I had never done this before, even like on Zoom calls, I was criticizing what I look like or how I sound. I know people do that, but that wasn't a thing that I had done before. Mm-hmm. It felt almost like I was looking for all the things that were wrong with me. Yes. To sort of explain what was happening in my life at that time. And I noticed it. I mean, I tend to have a higher level of self-awareness because I've spent years sort of working on this thing. And I noticed it and I thought, that is the weirdest thing ever, that yes. I'm now criticizing, look, like I can't find an outfit to wear. I don't know, like how nothing I put on looks right. Everything was wrong.
Yes. Totally. So it's like you were almost trying to feel a sense of control. Like, okay, it's these things. If I beat myself up for this, if I can fix those things, it will fix everything. Not to mention you were kind of kicking yourself when you're down, which is very common. And I'll also just make note that, especially as women, it's interesting when we feel a sense of meaning and purpose from our careers, which we really all should, right? When we don't have that, we tend to fall back on the things that society judges us for, right? Mm. So when we don't have a strong career or a sense of purpose in some other area, oh, well, I'm not beautiful enough. I'm not thin enough. I'm not young enough. All of these things that I'm supposed to be. So whereas for so many women, they're like, I've never cared about those extra 5 pounds, or like if I have some gray hair or whatever, like all of a sudden they might fixate on that. Oh, well, here's an area where I can somehow have relevance and meaning in this world. So it sounds
Another
like
thing I noticed, Megan, was I was fixated on other people's problems too, right? So stuff that was going wrong in other people's lives, I was critical of why they weren't doing more to fix it or why they were behaving in a certain way. And it's almost kind of funny now looking back. I can see that I was trying to like fix everybody else because I didn't know how to fix what was going on in my life.
Totally. Again, trying to feel that sense of control. And then also, I mean, gosh, it is so common when we maybe aren't quite ready to fully look in the mirror ourselves to see ourselves and others, and be critical or judgmental of certain things, but not necessarily at a place yet where we're ready to really kind of confront where we believe we have let ourselves down or failed, because again, we often don't have the self-compassion to do that. So with your example, and thank you again for being so vulnerable and for sharing all of that, when you were maybe being super critical to yourself for how your voice sounded or what you looked like or these other areas, I mean, everything related to your business as well, my guess is, if a friend of yours were in the same position, you might not say those things to them, right? Like, how would you respond to a friend who is sharing, oh gosh, like I'm just feeling terrible. I feel like such a fraud. All these people are going to see that I've failed and I don't feel like I exist anymore. What would you say to them?
Yeah. So I actually would encourage them to focus on the positive.
Yeah.
And one of my friends who's also an entrepreneur said to me, this business is failing, but what have you accomplished over the past 5 years with this business? Like, take a step back and look at all the people you've helped, all the people you've employed, all the revenue you've generated.
Totally.
Look at all of those things and try to shift your attention to focus on that. Yes. And not on the rawness of what's happening in this moment, right? This isn't pleasant. This isn't fun, but there are so many things that you could take away from it that are positive. And that actually helped me to shift to think about, okay, sometimes there are unpleasant things that happen in life for whatever reasons, but there are also good things that came out of it.
Totally. I mean, gosh, like when you think about the amount of money that we spend on education, right? Like we invest in our knowledge and our skills and our experience through paying hundreds of thousands of dollars, for education in some cases, right? And what's to say that a failed business is not very much an example of that? Okay, right. Sure. Maybe you didn't come out like with a ton of revenue or profit, I should say, but sounds like you learned a lot, right? And had this so much experience. So, of course it's harder sometimes in the moment to really like absorb that and to feel, like it resonates. But certainly it sounds like now you're able to reflect on that and say, oh yeah, for sure. And even in the moment, it sounds like that was really helpful in shifting your perspective. So those are that's like an example of maybe what would be a self-compassionate response. What to really break down self-compassion, and I'll try to give you the abridged version of this. Again, the idea of compassion, I wish we had a different word because I think a lot of people, especially men, especially entrepreneurs, don't always resonate with it. But we want to think of compassion as having like a yin and a yang. Like it's got kind of like a masculine and a feminine. And oftentimes we think it's all about the feminine or about the yin, which is about like empathy and sympathy and patience and tolerance and forgiveness and warmth and like all of these really like yummy, nice things that we want and deserve, but oftentimes feel uncomfortable with, especially if we're very hard on ourselves. But the yang is kind of like that stronger energy, the masculine energy. And that's all about like expectations, boundaries, accountability, respect and self-respect, an expectation for growth. Like there's this whole kind of camp that we forget, and that is part of compassion. And another way to think about it for anyone who's a parent or a leader for that matter, I mean, it's really about leadership. It's self-leadership. It's self-parenting. It's like, you're still going to expect your child to go to school and to have dinner before dessert and like, make their bed. And there are all these things. And you're doing that because that is teaching them to kind of like show up for themselves and show up in the world in a way that will be helpful for them. You're not punishing them. You're not trying to be mean or cruel. You're actually really trying to kind of set them up for success. And it's the same thing with our relationship to ourselves. It's not actually compassionate to be like, I'm not going to do anything. I quit work. I'm going to lie on the couch all day and eat Cheetos and like never emerge from this hole and just go down on Instagram and TikTok for the rest of my life. Like nobody wants to live that life. That would be a recipe for depression so quickly. And so many people are afraid that when they are kind to themselves, when they're understanding of whatever their difficult emotions are, when they have realistic expectations for themselves rather than ones that are totally unrealistic and leave them paralyzed because they're afraid of failure, they think that if they are kind and all of those sorts of things, then they are going to become complacent and lazy. And they're just going to be, again, lose respect for their appearance or for their relationships, and they'll have no integrity. And that's not the case at all. Like we still want people to bring their integrity to the table and all of that. But it's also just about having that yin as well, which is like, hey, you're a human being. Well, like the rest of us, we are imperfect. There's no script for this. It's not a dress rehearsal. We're doing this all for the first time. We're all just really fumbling through life, and none of us is exempt or immune from things like disappointment and shame and hurt and loneliness and anxiety and frustration and all of those sorts of things. That is really just what makes us human. So when we can help people, first of all, bring an approach to themselves, it's like, oh, you're allowed to look imperfect, act imperfectly, have imperfect thoughts, and have imperfect emotions. People are like, oh, this wave of relief. Wait, what? I'm allowed to feel sad at times or anxious? I'm allowed to like have a thought that maybe isn't like the purest or the kindest. Yes, of course. Maybe don't act on it all the time, but like, it's okay to have some of those thoughts, right? I'm allowed to fail. I'm allowed to make mistakes. I'm allowed to let people down. Of course, it's honestly, you'd have to live in a bubble to not do those things. It's not about whether or not you let people down. It's about whether or not you repair those relationships, right, to stay within your integrity. So self-compassion is sort of, there's the more holistic, like, hey, here's the approach to humanity and self-compassion, in terms of just, like human beings as a whole. But then there's also the in the moment, which is, okay, how am I responding to myself? When I'm going through a moment of suffering, as Kristen Neff, who is like the self-compassion guru, says, when I'm in those moments of suffering, can I be with that? And can I respond to myself, first of all, somatically, maybe like I'm imagining my pet is with me, right? Or alternatively, if my pet, I don't know, hurt their paw or something, or had a surgery and is wearing a cone on their neck, I'm loving and I'm nurturing to them. Like, can I bring that nurturing energy, that loving energy, and to kind of give and receive compassion to myself somatically? And then can I say something to myself, like what I might say to a friend? And my sort of sentence starter that I teach all of my clients, I give them all a script to work with that feels very foreign at first because it really is like learning another language. My sentence starter is, if I was saying with Ivy, maybe a term of endearment like sweetheart, baby girl, whatever you want to call yourself. It is understandable that you are feeling whatever you're feeling, because whatever the reason is that you're feeling that way. So that's where we first starting to empathize with your feelings. So Ivy, sweetheart, it is understandable that you're feeling embarrassed because right now you're feeling exposed and you think that everyone's looking at you and watching you fail. And you feel, embarrassed about that. That makes sense, right? And then the second part is, it's understandable that whatever the behavior is that you're judging yourself for whatever the reason is, it's understandable that your business is failing because, well, what are all the reasons that it makes sense? And come at it not just from a place of like, oh, beating yourself up. I didn't do this right. I didn't do that right. But like, let's look at all the factors. Let's look at the economy. Let's look at the marketplace. Let's look at, the various different things that may have happened along the way. Let's look at, again, maybe, limiting factors that are without your control. For example, to give you a share from my own life, I reflected on this year and I was like, wow, like my business actually made more money last year than it did this year. And I had a moment of like, oh, like that sucks. Like I've been in like a pretty straight trajectories before that. But you know what? I lost my mom this year suddenly. And I got married and planned a wedding. I moved to a new city. Like a lot of things happened that got in the way of me being able to just focus on growth. And that's okay. And I had a lot of personal growth as a result, I'll tell you that much. But ultimately coming back to that sort of sentence starter of, it's understandable that you feel this way. And it's understandable that here's the reason why this happened. And we make our decisions based on the information we have at the time. And here were all the decisions you made based on the information. Now hindsight's 2020. And again, this is not meant to just in one conversation with yourself make everything better. But what it is meant to do is alleviate some of that shame so that you can actually process the grief, the sadness, the loss, like all of what is very understandable and honestly, like kind of impossible to avoid when you say goodbye or to a business that you worked on for how long?
5 years.
5 years. 5 years of your life, right? With a very different expected outcome. Right. So when we remove the shame, we can actually get to the emotions underneath that are the ones that are deserving of your sympathy, your empathy, your processing, and move that through. So then we can kind of like still have had the experience, but get to a point where you've processed it enough that when you think about the experience, those emotions don't come up. And that's really what processing is. Processing is about whether it's trauma, whether it's grief, whatever the experience is, it is getting to a point where you can acknowledge the story and recognize it, and maybe not have your voice choke up when you tell it. Maybe not feel that intensity, maybe not want to avoid it, maybe not rush to the fridge or the drink or whatever it is when you think about it. And with self-compassion, we can allow ourselves to do that. Obviously, therapy and coaching can be super helpful. Other forms of moving emotions through us, like I mentioned, whether it's dance or yoga or Tai Chi or, breath work or meditation, or I'm a huge fan of psychedelics, honestly. Like there's a lot of space for moving and processing all of this stuff through. And that's when we can reach a point where it's like, oh, those are just the lessons in a book that are from my life.
Megan, this has been a fascinating conversation. I have learned so much. Any last words or last thoughts for founders who may be listening to this or watching this, taking the next step to help them to process their emotions and to sort of reframe what they're experiencing?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you, Ivy, for having me. It's been just so fun. And I'm so happy that you're putting these conversations out to the world. I really believe that part of the reason we are so held back by shame and perfectionism is because we think we're the only ones doing it imperfectly or not knowing what we're doing. And so we just become paralyzed. And so when we hear these conversations, it helps us feel a little less alone and realize like, oh yeah, I mean, it's not supposed to be a straight line, or it's not supposed to all be clear. We can kind of figure it out as we go. And so I think on that, my last words are sort of a piece of advice, which is not going to be that profound, honestly, is just that really, so much of this is about noticing our shame, both the chronic shame that underlies our fear of failure or our perfectionism, but also the shame around like an instance of what we perceive as failure, not meeting our own expectations or the expectations we perceive others to have for us, having an imperfect emotion, being in a mood, not being as articulate as we want to be or as perfect as we want to be in some way. And ultimately, when we start to become more in touch with that shame and recognize it, we can know when it's showing up and be like, oh, I see you, shame. Like, I know what you're trying to do, but I'm going to do it anyway. And one thing that is so important, so the most important, I think, for entrepreneurs, for anyone really, when you're learning to work with and metabolize shame is community and safe community, connections with people who remind you that you're all in it together. You're all doing it imperfectly. It's okay. Like who can kind of shepherd you in some ways by being like, yeah, here's my story. I screwed up doing this thing. Or like, yeah, this was a really awful experience for me. I mean, even you sharing your story, Ivy, like I can't imagine how many people that will empower to be like, oh, she failed and she lived to tell the tale. Wait, the world didn't end? Cause like, that's what my mind's telling me is going to happen. Right. So for anyone listening who is thinking like, okay, what is the next step here? I mean, of course, if it's within your means, I think like coaching or therapy are so helpful for this process. But really like community groups, whether it's like, if you're lucky enough to live in a city like New York or LA or whatever, there's a lot of those entrepreneurial communities there. But I mean, really, there are either in-person entrepreneurial communities or there are online communities everywhere. Or it's like find 5 of your friends who are 5 people who are also trying to start a business and do like a weekly mastermind or something where you can get together and just talk about like, hey, here's what's going well this week. And here's the thing I'm struggling with. And it could be, I need to hire someone and I'm not really sure about like what the next steps or who my first hire should be. Or it could be something like, I'm really struggling because, I am, and I hear this from a lot of men, I want to date and I want to find a partner, but like, I don't think I can do that until I know I'm like really successful because I don't want to be seen. I'm not ready to be seen. And they're not always using this language, but I'm not ready to be seen in what I perceive as my failure, or I'm not ready. I have to wait until I'm at this place. And yet that's causing them to be so lonely. And so it's like, okay, well, what would it be like to, date from a place of building? I'm in the building process, here's where I am, and noticing that other people might have that struggle as well. So yes, I guess like my kind of last words are, if any of this resonates with you, and I imagine if you made it this far, then it has, then focus on community, safe community where people can be vulnerable and talk about this kind of stuff. And I would also offer, if you're not yet sort of in touch with your emotions, and most of us aren't, maybe go to either like feelingswheel.com or like download something that can help you identify feelings and try to set an alarm for once a day, or maybe it's every time you get in an elevator, or maybe it's every time you get in your car and you're driving to work or whatever it is. And just try to give yourself a moment to notice, what am I noticing in my body right now? What are some of the sensations and emotions that might be coming up? You don't need to judge them. You don't need to push them away. You don't need to make make meaning of them or anything like that. This is just about becoming more acquainted with your emotions, because the more you can become more acquainted with your body and your emotions, that's when you can kind of, instead of being at the mercy of them and always being reactive, that's when you're like the Jedi warrior, spiritual gangster who can be like, okay, this is what's going on. Here's how I'm going to respond in a healthier way.
Thank you so much for that, Megan. This has been enlightening. It's been educational. It's been fun to talk to you.
Likewise.
And I think everybody who's listening will take away something important. So thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Ivy. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of Anatomy of Failure. A big thank you to Megan Bruneau for sharing her expertise and valuable strategies for conquering the fear of failure. Remember, you're not alone on this journey. Failure is part of growth, and there's so much to learn along the way. If you found this episode helpful, be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. Anatomy of Failure is available everywhere you get your podcasts. You can also listen and subscribe through my website, anatomyoffailurepodcast.com. Subscribers through my website can get access to the video version of this podcast and an incredible array of resources like detailed show notes, including key takeaways and exercises discussed by guests, tools that support implementing what you learn from each podcast episode, and access to webinars, online courses, live sessions, bonus episodes, and so much more, including a surprise welcome gift. Tune in each week. We'll continue to examine the factors that lead to failure so that together we can learn how to get it right. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.